name is Matt Lischke, Senior Ag Advisor with Local Land Services. In this video, we'll be taking a close look at the pasture forecast, which can be viewed on the Farming Forecaster tool. Now, it's important to note that the information shown throughout this video is taken from June 2020. So it's just a snapshot of a point in time. And while the pasture forecast will obviously change over time, the methods and principles of how to read and interpret the information stays the same. So we're now on the homepage of Farming Forecaster, and the pasture forecast for each location is displayed in the top right-hand corner of the homepage. And this pasture forecast is produced by GrassGro, which is a decision support tool that was developed by CSIRO in the 1990s. So we can use this drop-down menu to select whatever site we are interested in. So at the moment, I'm going to use Gunning as an example. So Gunning is near Goulburn on the Southern Tablelands, and this pasture forecast covers from the 1st of June through till the end of September period. The pasture forecast provides information around the current pasture position, which is indicated by this black tracking worm, and also the likely range in pasture availability over the next 3 to 4 months, which is indicated by these coloured projection lines. And we'll have a closer look at the pasture forecast in a minute, but I just want to go through a few other things first. But below the pasture forecast, we have a pasture growth rate. This is a model growth rate out of GrassGro, so it's not a field measurement. And it's just worth noting that the pasture growth rate figure, so here it's showing 10 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day. This growth rate figure doesn't actually account for any pasture decay that might be occurring, whereas other sort of growth rate figures, published figures that you might find in, say, the ProGraze manual, those figures do account for decay. So the pasture growth rate figure on Farming Forecaster at certain times of the year, it will be a bit on the high side. Pasture growth rate, however, is a very useful piece of information and can be used in a whole range of ways. So, for example, if you're trying to calculate, how many stock you might put in a paddock, how long you might need to lock a paddock up to reach certain pasture targets, say for lambing or calving, things like that. So we've got a model growth rate for the location that you've selected under the pasture forecast. And below that, there's this More Pasture Detail button, and we can click on that, which will bring up a bigger version of this pasture graph, as well as some additional graphs and information that come out of the GrassGro model. So we'll just click on this More Pasture Detail button now. So we're now on the what we call the pasture forecast page, and as you can see, if I just slowly scroll down the page, we've got our pasture forecast graph, as well as a whole range of other graphs which are also displayed on this page. Now, before we look at some of these graphs in detail, I just wanted to point out this table at the very top of the page. And what this table contains is some important information regarding the farm system and the assumptions used in the GrassGro model. So the left-hand side of the table, there's a subheading here that says livestock, and this includes all the livestock information. So what enterprise is being run, whether it's a self-replacing merino flock, or is it a prime lamb flock, or a beef enterprise. So what enterprise is being run, some information around lambing or calving date and weaning dates. There's also information around what the year replacement sort of strategy is, and when surplus ewes and wethers are turned off, and also an annual DSC rating for this particular farm system. On the right-hand side of the page up the top, under the subheading environment, we have some information around what pasture is included for this location in the GrassGro model or pasture mix, soil type, some information on the soil type, what sort of fertility the site's sitting at in terms of soil fertility, elevation and climate. The information in this table is important to have a look at this because that will enable you to get a better handle on what the pasture forecast is and other graphs is actually based around. This page, so as previously mentioned, it contains your pasture forecast graph and a series of other graphs, which we'll look at in a moment, around plant available soil, water and ground cover. But also note down the bottom of this page, we also have some graphs around predicted livestock performance, supplementary feed requirements and so on. And these graphs around the livestock side of things are actually covered in a separate video called Making Sense of the Livestock Data. So in this particular video, we'll just be focusing on the top 3 graphs on this page. So as previously mentioned, the pasture forecast and the other graphs in this part of Farming Forecaster is produced by GrassGro. So what is GrassGro? GrassGro is a decision support tool that simulates pasture and animal production using a whole farm modelling approach. GrassGro has been extensively used by researchers, advisors and producers since the late 1990s and is based on decades of field experimentation from across Australia. So within GrassGro, farm systems have been custom built for each location using local weather data, soil type, and relevant pasture species. At each location, we've also selected a representative livestock enterprise, whether that be sheep or cattle, and a stocking rate has also been applied. Within that livestock enterprise, we've also built in standard management practices, which includes things like the time of lambing or calving, when weaning's occurring, rules around when stock are sold, and so on. Within GrassGro, we can do what's referred to as a tactical run. And a tactical run is where users can download historical weather data for a location. In this case, we're using the past 30 years of weather data, and then run GrassGro to look at the likely range of pasture and animal production outcomes over the next few months. And this is what the pasture forecast graphs and the other graphs in this part of Farming Forecaster are based on. They're based on tactical runs out of GrassGro. So within Farming Forecaster, a new tactical run is done at the beginning of each month. So the GrassGro model is spun up to the forecast date. And so here I've just got a screenshot of just an example of how this works. So the green line, you can see that the GrassGro model, and this is green herbage on the vertical axis. So this graph is showing how green herbage is varying. So the model is spun up until the current date. In this case, it was the 1st of September as an example. And then, based on the starting conditions, being soil moisture, pasture availability, livestock condition, etc., the model then uses the most recent 30 years of weather data to simulate the next 4 months. So in other words, based on the current conditions, what would happen over the next 4 months if we went back and applied weather conditions from 1990? And the program does a run based on based on the starting point. The program uses 1990 weather over this period and models what would have happened. The program then goes back and applies weather from 1991 and runs that, and so on. So the end result is we get 30 possible outcomes. one for each of the last 30 years. So if we now look at the current pasture forecast graph, and this is the gunning example. If we scroll down on this page and look at the pasture forecast graph, so this is as of late the 25th of June 2020. If we look at this graph, we can see that the model was spun up to the start of June, and then the model has then used the most recent 30 years of weather data to simulate pasture and livestock performance across this tactical period. Rather than presenting 30 individual pasture curves, the results are displayed as percentiles. And by default, the graph displays the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentiles, which you can see there on the side with these check boxes. So the yellow line is the 50th percentile or the median. So if you were to look at all the 30 outcomes for those 30 years in terms of pasture availability, in 15 years, pasture availability was above the yellow line, and the other 15 years, the pasture was below the yellow line. The blue line is the 90th percentile. Pasture availability only exceeded this level in 10% of years, and the red line is the 10th percentile, which means that pasture availability fell below this level through here in only 10% of years. So in summary, the yellow line is what you could expect to see if average conditions were experienced during the forecast period. The red and blue lines provide an indication of the likely range in pasture availability under both, exceptional growing conditions indicated by the blue line, or a very dry scenario, which would be the red line. The shaded area in the graph shows the historical range in pasture availability across the forecast period. The historical data is also displayed in percentiles and is based on the last 30 years of weather data. And at present, the 30 years covers from 1990 through to 2019. So the green zone is the historical 50 to 90th percentile band. So if the pasture forecast lines, if these solid projection lines sit within the green zone, this is indicating that pasture conditions are sitting above the long-term historical average. The orange zone is the historical 25th to 50th percentile. If the pasture forecast lines sit in the orange zone through here, this is indicating that pasture conditions are trending below average for this time of the year. The red zone is the 10th to 25th percentile band, and if pasture conditions were down in this sort of red territory, that would be indicating that pasture is sitting for this period is likely to be sitting well below average for this time of the year. So it'd be in the bottom 25% of years. The historic pasture curve, which is the shaded zones, it's important because it actually gives us a reference point to compare against. So pasture forecasts are run at the start of the month, and once they are run, they are effectively locked in place. The only thing that changes throughout the month then is this black tracking line, which tells us how, based on weather data, how things are actually tracking through the month. So this line is updated daily from the GrassGro model and shows how conditions or pasture conditions are changing throughout the month in response to daily weather. So in other words, daily changes in weather conditions are picked up by this black line. When you're looking at the pasture forecast graph, there are essentially three questions that you need to really think about and ask yourself. The first one is, how does the current pasture position, or the black line, sit in relation to the historical pasture curve? Is it above average? So is it sitting in a green zone? Is it below average? Or is it somewhere near the long-term average? Also note the slope and direction of the black line. Is it trending up, or is it flat, or is it trending down? The second thing, where do the projected lines sit in relation to the historical pasture curve? Are they starting in the red zone and trending well below average, and therefore indicating a very difficult scenario? Or are they starting near or above the long-term average? Also note the slope of these projection lines. Are they changing rapidly in either a negative or a positive direction? Or are they fairly flat with little change? The last thing to have a look at is how quickly do these projected lines spread apart? If these lines stay really quite close together, what this is indicating is that there is sufficient moisture in the system to drive future pasture growth. Whereas if the lines were to really separate quite quickly, what this is indicating is that moisture is limited and that future pasture growth is highly dependent on rainfall. So if we were to look at this example for gunning and just sort of think through those questions, the summary would be that the current pasture position, the black line, is currently sitting at the top of the green zone, which is around the 90th percentile. And this is purely a reflection of the exceptional start in this part of the region, or in the Goulburn region, to the 2020 season. It really has been quite an amazing autumn and start to the season. So, we've got current pasture right up near the 90th percentile. The projection lines, these coloured lines, they actually start towards the top of the green zone as well. And all three projection lines remain in the green zone right through the period. It's only really till you get to the very, very late September where the red line drops below into the orange zone. All in all, this site is sitting in an extremely robust position. The projected lines, if we look at the spread, they all stay pretty close together and follow a very similar pattern right through this projection period, which would give you a lot of confidence going forward. Now, just to compare, if we were to travel around 200 kilometres south at the moment to the Monero, the 2020 winter pasture outlook is entirely different. And this is what we're looking at here for one of the Monero sites. Unfortunately, the Monero really has missed out on the rainfall events over the last 3 to 4 months, and which is shown in the pasture outlook here. And unfortunately, the Monero is facing an extremely tough winter ahead. If we look at this example from one of the Monero sites, basically the summary would be that the current pasture position, so this black line, as you can see, is sitting well below the red zone. So it's even down below the 10th percentile line here. These projection lines, they start on the tip of the red. So they start off in a very, very low position historically, and all three lines are fairly flat in their trajectory across the page. Even if exceptional growing conditions were to eventuate, which would be this blue line, this blue line struggles to get to even 1,000 kilos of dry matter by the time lambing commences, and lambing at this site is around the middle of September. So, it's just highlighting that an extremely difficult winter lies ahead. In terms of the spread, again, the projected lines, they stay pretty close together through much of the forecast period. So not only is the soil exceptionally dry on the Monero at present, which is indicated by the plant available soil moisture, plant available water, box plot. We'll look at that in a moment. So, but not only is the soil exceptionally dry on the Monero at present, but any rainfall over the winter period is unlikely to really do a whole lot due to the cold conditions. The other thing I just wanted to note while we're looking at the pasture forecast graphs is that we've got time across the bottom here, and we've got available green herbage in kilograms of dry matter per hectare up the side. And it's important with these pasture forecast graphs, it's important to look at the overall trends and the trajectory of these forecast lines. Don't get too hung up on these numbers on the side, and don't be too concerned if they don't match exactly what you're seeing at home. Every property is going to be different, and these graphs will never replicate your situation exactly. Rather it's about looking at the overall trends from a couple of relevant sites and then applying the key messages to your farm and decision making. The other thing to note is that with these pasture forecast graphs, you can also use rainfall and temperature forecasts to assist in deciding, what percentile might be the most relevant. So, as previously mentioned, by default, the farming forecaster will display the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentile. But if say for the forecast for the next month or so was indicating a high chance of above median rainfall for your area and favourable growing conditions, then you might say, well, I might turn off the 10th percentile and just display the 50th, 70th, 5th, and 90th percentile. So you can use, the weather outlook to help you decide what sort of, what percentiles to show on this graph. The other thing to note is that pasture benchmarks can also be used to help interpret these graphs. So, for example, if we were to look at the ProGraze pasture benchmarks for pregnant ewes, it shows that ewes grazing high quality green feed of around 75% digestibility need around 500 kilos of dry matter to meet their requirements during mid-pregnancy. And this increases to around 700 kilos of dry matter per hectare in the last month. So if we have a look at this Monero example, we can see that green herbage is right down towards the bottom here, sitting around about 100 kilos thereabouts. So well below the minimum target of 500 kilos per hectare that's required during mid-pregnancy. And so that's obviously indicating that significant supplementary feeding will be required between now and lambing. In contrast, if we flick back to the gunning pasture graph, we can see that the black tracking worm for gunning is sitting up around about 13 to 1400 kilos, which is well above the requirement for mid-pregnancy through here. So what this is sort of indicating is that ewes would be putting on this sort of feed would be putting on significant condition, and one of the challenges in this scenario, and which has been a bit of a case in the region, is preventing pregnant stock from getting too fat. These pasture forecast graphs, they give you an indication of what direction things are heading, and if animal requirements are likely to be met or exceeded. And the earlier that you can identify a potential issue, the better position you'll be in to manage it. That sort of takes us through the pasture forecast graph. The other two things I just wanted to talk through while we're on this page is the plant available soil water graph, which sits directly below, and also the ground cover graph as well. The plant available water, or PAW, is a modelled reading from GrassGro, whereas the moisture probe is giving us a field measurement. So PAW, which is shown in this box plot, deals with plant available water across the entire root zone, whereas the moisture probe readings, we are focusing largely on the top 60 centimetres. So the benefit of the box plot, this PAW graph, is we can see how current soil moisture sits in relation to the last 30 years. The red dot is the current PAW reading, and this is an average reading over the last 3 days. So in this case, an average of the last 3 days as of the 25th of June 2020. So if we were to go into GrassGro and extract the PAW readings for the 25th of June across the last 30 years and sort these readings from smallest to largest, the middle 50% of readings, which would be 15 readings, would sit within the box. For simplicity, this could be referred to as the normal range or normal zone. The majority of the remaining values would sit between the edges of the box and the edges of the whiskers. So the whiskers on both the top whisker and the bottom whisker show how spread out the data is. So if the red dot sits within the upper whisker, like in this example from gunning, what this is telling us is that the current soil moisture is within the top 25% of readings for this time of year. So it's or in other words, it's in the wet, in the wet zone. It's well above normal for this time of the year. Alternatively, if this red dot, which like on the Monero example, we're sitting down here, what this would be indicating is that the current soil moisture is in the bottom 25% of years or in the dry zone. So if we now look at the modelled soil moisture level out of GrassGro versus our probe readings for the same site on the same day, we can see that given the wet start to the 2020 season on the tablelands, it's not surprising that the PAW measurement is sitting for gunning at around 88 mils and is just a fraction below this top whisker. So in other words, based on the last 30 years of data, the current reading of gunning for this time of the year is in the wet zone or in the top 25% of years. And this is really backed up by the soil moisture probe. What the probe, as you can see here, the probe is showing that the top 40 centimeters is fully wetted up and is actually sitting at field capacity. So this is sort of backing up what the modelled reading is sort of saying, but it's still the probe is actually showing though the soil is still quite dry at 60 centimeters. So the probe gives us an insight into where the moisture is sitting in the soil profile. So the PAW and the probe readings both provide different bits of information. The probe shows moisture content at various depths, whereas the PAW box plot tells us how current soil moisture sits in relation to history. Moving on, and this is the last graph which I'll focus on in this video, and this is the ground cover graph. So the ground cover graph provides information around both the current and projected ground cover levels for the forecast period, which in this case is the 1st of June through till the end of September. This graph is produced in the same way as the pasture forecast graph, but instead of herbage mass, we're now looking at ground cover as a percentage. The general rule of thumb is to maintain ground cover to at least 70%, because we know that once ground cover falls below 70%, the risk of soil loss through erosion increases dramatically. So the blue lines and orange lines show the range that ground cover is likely to sit in during the period. So in other words, the blue line is saying that which is the 90th percentile, this is saying that there's a 10% chance of ground cover being above or being better than that, whereas the orange line, which is the 10th percentile, is saying there's a 90% chance of being above that level there. And the yellow line is the midpoint of the projections, or the 50th percentile. So like the pasture forecast, when you're looking at the ground cover one, things to sort of focus on are the current position of the black tracking line. This is like the pasture forecast, this is updated daily. Where do the tactical lines start from and how quickly do they spread apart? And lastly, are the tactical lines indicating any potential ground cover issues? What are the chances of falling below the 70% benchmark? So if we look at this example from the gunning site, you can see that ground cover is currently with the black line sitting around about 96%, which is shown over on the summary on the right hand side. And all these tactical lines, they're very close together. And well above this 70% sort of minimum benchmark that we set. So this is indicating, as you would expect, the ground cover at this site is in a very robust position. By way of contrast, just due to the exceptionally dry conditions, which we've looked at with the Monero site, the ground cover graph looks very different and is indicating that there could be some ground cover issues ahead. So it's saying that current ground cover is at 67%, so already sort of breaching that 70% threshold. Yeah, we can see this steady decline over time through this black sort of tracking worm. Compared to the gunning example, there's much greater. If you look at these projection lines, there's much greater separation, which is indicating that ground cover is much more sensitive to seasonal conditions. And even if conditions were to improve to a fair degree and sort of kick back up towards this yellow line, you can see that there's still an overall sort of downward, even with the yellow lines, a bit of a downward trend from July onwards. It's definitely flagging that ground cover is currently an issue and likely to remain an issue for the remainder of the projection period. It's important to note, however, that within all these farming systems, there is no destocking strategy set in GrassGro. So the GrassGro model assumes that all stock are still being run on the property and are being fed in the paddock, which in reality, on the Monero at the moment, would probably be unlikely because, I guess given the difficult decisions at present, some form of destocking would have probably taken place. But nevertheless, if you were on the Monero and you were looking at these sorts of outputs and flagging obviously ground cover issues, obviously you'd be looking at getting stock off paddocks to try and protect ground cover and try and build some sort of pasture into key paddocks before lambing or calving. Destocking, there's obviously another options, could be achieved by selling, agistment, or even confinement feeding and putting stock in drought lots. That brings us to the end of the video. I hope you found that helpful in understanding the pasture forecast and other graphs that are around plant available water and ground cover. For more detailed information on other parts of the farming forecaster tool, please refer to the other videos in the series. Thank you.